That was the most shocking day of my life. My ex-fiancé Blaine was talking to my son, our son, the son he was never supposed to meet. I stood frozen, watching them laugh together like they'd known each other forever. In that moment, all the memories I'd buried came flooding back. It was 8 years ago when everything fell apart. I went to Blaine's penthouse that night, my heart full of hope and excitement. I was pregnant, and I was ready to tell him. I'd imagined his face lighting up, his arms pulling me close, promising we'd raise this child together. But instead, I walked into a nightmare. Catherine, Blaine's cruel mother, was waiting for me. She had laid her trap perfectly. Photos of me and Mark, my colleague, were spread across the table. Her voice was cold, her accusations sharp. She called me a cheater, claimed I was betraying Blaine. I tried to speak, but the damage was already done. Blaine looked at me with confusion, then hurt, and finally doubt. Catherine didn't stop. She had messages, stories, every piece of proof twisted to paint me as guilty. I felt my world crumbling. Desperate to hold on to him, I told Blaine about the baby. I pulled out the ultrasound, tears streaming down my face, pleading for him to see the truth. But Catherine was relentless. She questioned the baby's paternity, planting seeds of suspicion so deep they took root instantly. Blaine hesitated. His trust wavered. And then he believed her. I left that night shattered, my heart broken into pieces I thought could never be repaired. I vowed to protect my child from the pain I had endured. Blaine would never know about his son. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Blaine had trusted me once, loved me deeply. How could he have believed his mother so quickly? Catherine was always manipulative, but this felt calculated, almost too perfect. I needed answers. I found myself driving to Mark's office, a knot tightening in my stomach. Mark had always been there for me during the rough patches with Blaine. He was a good listener, a steady shoulder to lean on. But now, his presence and Catherine's accusations made everything murky. As I stood outside his office door, memories of his reassuring words echoed in my mind. How he'd always tell me Blaine didn't deserve me. I knocked, and when he greeted me, his smile felt forced. His eyes flickering with something I couldn't place. I confronted him, laying everything out, the pictures Catherine had shown Blaine, the way they'd been weaponized against me. I needed to know if he'd been involved. His hesitation said more than his words ever could. Mark admitted it. He hadn't just known about Catherine's scheme, he had been a part of it. His reasons left me speechless. He confessed that he'd always had feelings for me, that he wanted me to see him the way he saw me. He thought he was helping, but his actions had destroyed everything I held dear. I felt sick. Mark wasn't the friend I thought he was. He wasn't the anchor I'd leaned on during my storm. He was part of the storm. Betrayed, I left, unable to process how deeply the people around me had failed me. But the hits kept coming. When I told my family about my situation, their reactions were crushing. My parents never approved of Blaine. They saw his wealth and power as a barrier, something that made him unreachable, someone who couldn't truly belong in my world. Instead of support, I was met with judgment. My mother suggested I let go, as if I hadn't already lost enough. My father didn't ask questions. He leveled accusations. To them, my pregnancy was another poor choice, another mark of failure. They doubted the child was Blaine's, their disdain for him blinding them to the truth. I stood there, absorbing their words, but I refused to feel ashamed. I wasn't guilty of the things they believed. I knew my truth, and I knew I'd have to stand by it alone. My first appointment was a nightmare. The doctor could tell something was wrong before I even said a word. She noticed how tense I was, how my emotions were fraying at the edges. When she took my vitals, her expression tightened. My blood pressure was dangerously high, and she seemed genuinely concerned. She asked if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I put into words the crushing weight I was carrying? How could I tell her that the father of my child thought I was a liar and a cheater? Then she delivered the blow. There were complications with my pregnancy. She didn't go into detail at first, only saying tests were needed to understand the extent of the problem. Tests that were expensive. My heart sank. It wasn't just my life at stake anymore. It was my baby's. My child, the one piece of hope I clung to amidst the chaos, was in danger. I felt like screaming, crying, anything to release the fear building inside me, but I couldn't fall apart. Not now. I had to stay strong. I couldn't afford those tests on my own. My financial situation was dire, and the reality was clear. I needed help. And there was only one person who could provide it, Blaine. The thought of seeing him again filled me with dread. He had pushed me away, believed his mother's lies, and left me to fend for myself. but he was training to become a surgeon. If anyone could understand the urgency of my situation, it would be him. For the sake of our child, I had to try. With the medical reports clutched in my trembling hands, I made my way to the hospital where Blaine worked. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air as I entered, a harsh reminder of the life and death stakes surrounding me. My legs felt like lead as I walked through the halls, searching for him. I spotted him in the corridor, his white coat pristine, his expression focused. He was talking to a colleague, exuding the calm confidence that had once drawn me to him. But when I stepped into his path, his demeanor changed. His eyes darkened the moment he saw me, and his face hardened with cold indifference. I tried to speak, to explain, but before I could get the words out, he brushed me off. He refused to listen, his rejection as sharp as a knife slicing through me. A security guard approached, urging me to leave. My desperation grew. I pleaded for Blaine to hear me out, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear and exhaustion. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Concern, maybe even doubt. It was the smallest crack in the wall he'd built between us. Finally, he relented. He told me to meet him somewhere private where we could talk. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with apprehension. I knew this conversation would determine everything. When Blaine walked onto the terrace 5 minutes later, his annoyance was palpable. The man who had once loved me so deeply now looked at me with nothing but contempt. I could feel my heart pounding as I tried to find the courage to speak. I explained why I had come, my voice trembling with every word. I needed his help. I needed money for our child. But Blaine's response was ice cold. He didn't even hesitate. To him, this wasn't his child. The accusations his mother had planted in his mind had taken root so deeply that there was no room for doubt, no room for reason. He moved closer, his words sharp and unforgiving. He accused me of coming to him only because of his wealth, dismissing my plea as nothing more than manipulation. The Blaine I once knew, the kind, compassionate man, was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I tried to explain, but my voice faltered under the weight of his anger. The pain in his eyes wasn't the pain of love betrayed. It was something darker, colder. His words were a final blow, reminding me that he had no kindness left for me. I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. If Blaine, the father of my child, wouldn't help, then who would? I had no answers, no plan, just the devastating realization that I was completely alone in this fight. I lowered my head and walked away, tears burning my eyes. Blaine didn't stop me. He didn't call after me. He simply let me go, as if I meant nothing to him anymore. That day I made a promise to myself. I would never reach out to Blaine again. No matter how hard life became, I would figure things out on my own. I would never subject myself or my child to his coldness again. But life had other plans. 8 months later, I held my son Max in my arms for the first time. He was perfect. His tiny hands, his soft cries, and those deep blue eyes, Blaine's eyes, reminded me of what we had shared and lost. Being a single mother was brutal from the start. Every day was a new challenge, a battle to give Max the life he deserved. I faced judgment from the world and from my own family, who had turned their backs on me. But through it all, I pushed forward. Max became my reason for everything. He gave me strength I didn't know I had. I learned what it meant to fight for someone with every ounce of love in your heart. Being a single mother wasn't just about survival, it was about defying the odds, no matter how impossible they seemed. Blaine and my family had abandoned me, but I refused to let their actions define my son's future. Max deserved the best life I could give him, and I was determined to provide it. No matter what sacrifices it took, I would ensure that he grew up surrounded by love and security. Those blue eyes of his were a constant reminder of the past, a past I couldn't erase but had to live with. And though Blaine was no longer part of my life, Max became my everything, the light that guided me through the darkest of days. He was my joy, my anchor, my reason to keep going. Max gave my life purpose, even in the darkest moments. But one night, as I tucked him into bed, his innocent question shattered me. He asked why he didn't have a daddy like the other kids. The words pierced my heart, but I forced a smile, reassuring him the only way I knew how. I told him he had a mommy who loved him more than anything in the world. He nodded, accepting my answer, and snuggled closer. As I held him tightly, I whispered a promise to myself and to him. No matter what happened, I would never let him down. I would always fight for him. Then life delivered another devastating blow. Max became very ill, and the diagnosis left me reeling. He needed an urgent bone marrow transplant. Time was against us, and I was desperate for a solution. Max's questions grew heavier. He asked if he would ever get better, his innocent eyes searching mine for reassurance. I clutched his hand, forcing myself to stay strong. I told him he would, promising him that I would never give up, but inside I felt the crushing weight of uncertainty. I thought of Blaine. It had been 4 years since I'd last seen him. In that time, he had become a successful surgeon, working at one of the top hospitals in Phoenix. The idea of reaching out to him filled me with dread, but I had no choice. Blaine was Max's biological father, and if there was any chance he could help save our son, I had to take it. The fear I felt was overwhelming, the same fear I had experienced all those years ago when Blaine had turned his back on me. But this wasn't about me anymore. It was about Max. The next day, I forced myself to pick up the phone and dial Blaine's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, my pulse racing as I waited. Finally, he answered. His voice was just as cold and detached as I remembered. He knew it was me immediately, his tone clipped and uninterested. He asked what I wanted after all these years, his words sharp and uninviting. The sting of his indifference hit me, but I couldn't let it stop me. I pushed past my fear, my pride, and my pain. Blaine was my only hope. For Max's sake, I had to find a way to make him listen. The call ended abruptly, but Blaine had agreed to see me. I wouldn't have reached out if it weren't a matter of life and death, and I told myself that his coldness didn't matter. When I arrived at his home, the air was heavy with tension. Blaine wasn't alone. His fiancée, Sophia, and his mother, Catherine, were there, their presence oppressive and unwelcoming. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of their judgment. Sophia was stunning, her poise and elegance contrasting sharply with my own exhaustion. She stood close to Catherine, whose disdain for me was palpable. Her glare was sharp enough to cut, and her lips curled into a sneer the moment our eyes met. "You have some nerve showing up here." Her body language screamed louder than words, her hostility undeniable. As I steadied myself, my hand instinctively touched the necklace I wore, a small token from a time when Blaine and I were happy. It was the heart of the sea, a piece Blaine had given me 6 years ago, back when love still connected us. Sophia's gaze locked onto it immediately. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion, and Catherine seized the opportunity. Her accusations came quickly, her voice venomous. She declared that I had stolen the necklace, insisting it was an heirloom belonging to their family. Her words were calculated, designed to humiliate and discredit me further. Blaine's reaction was restrained. He knew the truth. He had given me that necklace as a symbol of our love, but his silence cut deep. Though he didn't side with Catherine, he also didn't step forward to defend me. The Blaine I had once loved would have stood by me, but that Blaine no longer existed. The humiliation was unbearable. I felt the heat of their judgment, the weight of the past pressing down on me. My instinct was to run, and that's exactly what I did. As I turned to leave, I heard Blaine call after me, but it was too late. The moment felt like a cruel, suffocating reminder of how far I had fallen in their eyes. I wanted to lash out, to defend myself, but I was too tired, too defeated. As I left, I managed to summon a parting shot, a reminder that my silence wasn't weakness. The sting of that encounter stayed with me. The rejection, the coldness, the lack of understanding, it all weighed heavily on my heart. But life didn't offer much time to dwell. The next day at work, a new challenge awaited me. My boss dropped a file on my desk with an air of barely contained excitement. When I opened it, I saw the name that had haunted me for years, Blaine Dexter. It was his house design. The project was non-negotiable. The universe seemed to have a cruel sense of humor, throwing me back into Blaine's orbit when I was least prepared. I had no choice but to face him again, this time in a professional setting. The meeting that followed was everything I had expected, awkward and cold. Blaine and I were polite, but there was no warmth, no sign of the connection we once shared. The entire time, Blaine sat still, his dark eyes studying me in a way that made my thoughts scatter even more. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as I struggled to keep my composure, but the embarrassment was overwhelming. Finally, he cut through my tangled words with a sharp shift in focus, suggesting we eat before continuing. His tone was casual, but the sudden change left me stunned. Dinner with Blaine wasn't something I had anticipated, and little did I know it would turn out to be the least complicated part of my evening. As we sat at the table, I watched him order food with the same calm confidence he'd always exuded. The familiarity of it struck me. Memories of our past dinners flooded back, uninvited. But this wasn't the Blaine I used to know. This Blaine was colder, more distant, and completely unaware that his little boy, Max, was fighting for his life in a hospital not far from where we sat. I forced myself to focus, pushing away thoughts of the past and the heavy secret I carried. The stakes were too high for me to let my emotions cloud my judgment. I apologized for my earlier flustered behavior, trying to regain some semblance of professionalism. Blaine barely acknowledged my attempt to smooth things over, but his next words caught me off guard. He brought up our last encounter, insisting that there was more I wanted to say. His tone was steady, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity that felt strangely genuine. For a moment, I froze. How could I begin to tell him the truth? That his son was in desperate need of a bone marrow transplant, that the child he'd rejected years ago was now clinging to life. The words wouldn't come. Just as I was struggling to find a way to respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was the hospital. Blaine's name flashed across the screen as the caller, but it wasn't him. It was St. Mary's Hospital calling him for an emergency surgery. I asked about his connection to the hospital, and he explained he'd recently been transferred there. My heart raced as I processed the coincidence. Not only was Max bound to a hospital bed, but he was at St. Mary's. The universe was pushing us together in ways I hadn't anticipated. For a moment, hope stirred within me. The possibility of Blaine and Max meeting felt closer than ever, but I knew it wasn't something I could force. Blaine had to want to be part of Max's life, and right now, he didn't even know Max existed. As Blaine prepared to leave for the hospital, he surprised me once more. He invited me to his place that evening, suggesting we finish our conversation there. His words hung in the air as he walked away, leaving me to grapple with the sudden shift in our dynamic. Underneath the veneer of professionalism, there was something electric, almost dangerous, that lingered between us. It was subtle, but undeniable, like a storm waiting to break. As I watched Blaine walk away, his broad shoulders disappearing through the door, a familiar ache stirred within me, a reminder of what we once had and what I had lost. That evening, I arrived at his place, unsure of what to expect. This time, he was alone. The air between us was thick with tension, a silent battle of wills playing out in every glance and gesture. I could tell he noticed my discomfort. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to take pleasure in my unease. He didn't need to say much to cut me down. His gaze, his posture, even the subtle curl of his lips, everything about him radiated judgment. I could feel his silent accusations as if they were spoken aloud. He exuded a cold confidence, as though he held the moral high ground, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. The way he carried himself now was different. He was polished, composed, and distant. There was no trace of the man who once held me close, who whispered promises of forever. Instead, he seemed to relish the power he had over me, the ability to remind me of my mistakes without uttering a single word. But I wasn't about to let him see me falter. If he wanted a battle of words, I was ready. I held my head high, masking the sting of his thinly veiled insults with a calm, detached demeanor. Every subtle jab he delivered was met with a quiet, measured response. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. As we exchanged these unspoken blows, memories of our past surged through my mind. I remembered the way we used to be, the fire, the passion, the connection that felt unbreakable. But now, that same fire had turned to ash, leaving only bitterness and regret in its place. It wasn't just his words that hurt. It was the reminder of what we had lost. There had been a time when Blaine looked at me as though I were the center of his world. Now his gaze was cold, scrutinizing, and filled with disdain, and yet beneath the surface I could sense something else, something unspoken. Was it regret, resentment, or perhaps a lingering flicker of the bond we once shared? I couldn't tell, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As our exchange continued, the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on me. I felt anger bubbling beneath my calm exterior, not just at Blaine, but at myself for letting his words affect me. I was frustrated at the years of pain and misunderstanding that had brought us to this point. Finally, the tension became too much. I couldn't bear to stay in that room any longer, surrounded by the ghosts of what could have been. Without a word, I turned and walked away, my anger and hurt propelling me forward. Days later, my boss pressed me for an update on Blaine's house design. Reluctantly, I sent a message to Blaine, requesting a straightforward exchange of house keys to finalize the work. His response was curt, almost dismissive. 2:00 this afternoon, followed by an unfamiliar address. When I arrived at the imposing mansion, I felt a fleeting sense of relief at the absence of Blaine's car in the driveway. Perhaps this would be a simple, uneventful visit, but fate had other ideas. The door opened to reveal Sophia, her smile disarming yet unmistakably calculated. Her voice dripped with charm, but beneath it lay something more dangerous. "Blaine asked me to meet you," she began, the sweetness of her tone a thin veil for the edge beneath it. "He's tied up at the hospital." The mansion was a masterpiece, clean, modern lines with just enough opulence to exude wealth without overstatement. I stepped inside, taking in the grandeur, but Sophia's presence was impossible to ignore. As I began measuring and taking notes, her small talk quickly morphed into something sharper. "How long has it been since you and Blaine last saw each other?" she asked casually, though the intent behind the question was anything but innocent. The air between us shifted. Her questions were too deliberate, her interest too pointed. I kept my answers brief, but it was clear she was playing a game. "I've seen your picture," she added after a pause, her tone light but her gaze piercing. "On Blaine's computer, a group photo, I think." Her words sliced through the air, a calculated dig that set me on edge. Then she pivoted, her tone deceptively casual. "Don't worry. Even if it had been just the two of you, I wouldn't feel threatened. I know it's impossible between you two now." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, especially with Blaine's mother involved. "She can be terrifying." My smile froze, but Sophia's eyes glimmered with satisfaction. Her next move was as precise as a chess player advancing her queen. "That's a stunning necklace," she said, her voice deceptively curious. "Where did you get it?" Instinctively, my hand went to the pendant resting against my chest, the heart of the sea. "A friend gave it to me," I said, the words clipped. Sophia tilted her head, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. "Not just a friend, though, is it? That's no ordinary necklace. It's the heart of the sea, priceless, unique, a symbol of one's true love." Her words hit like a thunderclap. For 6 years, I'd believed Blaine when he said it wasn't worth much. Yet now, its significance was clear. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a testament to what we once shared. Sophia's eyes never left me, her amusement barely hidden. "Did your husband give it to you?" I shook my head, my voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. "No, just a friend." But we both knew the truth was far more complicated. Before I could dwell on her words, my phone buzzed. The hospital's number flashed on the screen, a cold reminder of reality. It was about Max. My heart seized as I answered. "I have to go," I said abruptly, turning toward the door. Sophia's smile lingered, but there was something sinister beneath it. "We'll see about that," she said cryptically. Her words followed me as I raced to the hospital. Max was delirious when I arrived, his tiny body burning with fever. He was calling out for a father he had never met, his fragile voice breaking my heart. Dr. Luna's advice was firm and terrifying. I had to contact Blaine immediately. But when I called, it wasn't Blaine who answered. It was Sophia. Her voice was icy, her threat unmistakable. "Stay away from Blaine. Decline the project, or I'll make sure Max is transferred to another hospital." I barely had time to process her cruelty before chaos erupted around me. Shouts echoed down the corridor. A man from the psychiatric ward had escaped, his eyes wild and unhinged. In his hand, he clutched a bottle of sulfuric acid, its contents sloshing ominously as he shouted Blaine's name. I froze, horror gripping me as I realized Blaine was somewhere in the chaos, and the man was heading straight for him. Without thinking, I stepped forward, placing myself between Blaine and the man. The sharp sting of liquid hitting my skin was immediate, the pain spreading like wildfire. My vision blurred as I heard panicked voices around me. I was rushed to the emergency room, my body trembling with shock. Blaine, who had always been the picture of calm under pressure, was visibly shaken. His usually steady demeanor cracked as he demanded answers from the medical staff. "What were you doing here, Zoe?" he asked, his voice sharp but edged with worry. A doctor approached, delivering a surprising revelation. "She's very lucky," the doctor said. It was a false alarm. The liquid wasn't sulfuric acid. It was some kind of chili pepper concoction. The damage would have been far worse otherwise. Relief washed over Blaine, but his expression remained stormy as he turned back to me. His voice was uncharacteristically soft when he asked, "How does it feel to be a hero?" I forced a weak smile, trying to lighten the moment. "If you're thinking of thanking me, I'll gladly accept it." Blaine took over treating my wounds, his touch careful yet precise. The sensation was both comforting and unnerving, stirring up memories I'd buried long ago. As he worked, he suddenly asked a question that left me breathless. "Do you still love me, Zoe? Is that why you're here? Is that why you stepped in?" I froze, unable to answer. The weight of his words hung between us, fragile and dangerous. He sighed, his voice shifting to something colder. "Never mind, it doesn't matter anymore." With that, he gathered my things and walked me to his car. His actions were deliberate, almost robotic, as he opened the door and waited for me to get in. Once I was seated, he glanced at me briefly. "Fasten your seatbelt," he said. I complied, my hands trembling slightly. Memories of the past resurfaced, how he used to lean over to fasten my seatbelt for me, always with a playful grin or a gentle word. Now, the gesture felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The drive was quiet, the scenery outside a blur. I stared out the window, trying to ignore the ache in my chest. Out of nowhere, Blaine's voice broke the silence. "What time do you get off work?" I turned to him, confused by the abruptness of the question. 5 o'clock, I answered hesitantly. He didn't seem satisfied with the response. "No, I mean from your job at Enclave." The mention of my other job startled me. How did he know? 3 in the morning, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Blaine frowned, his expression darkening. "Do you really need money that badly?" The question stung, but I nodded. "Yes," I said simply. His frustration was palpable. "What about Matthew? Doesn't he have money to help you? Why do you need to work so hard?" His assumption that Matthew was my husband hung in the air like an accusation. I shook my head quickly. "No, Matthew is just a friend. He's already done so much for Max and me. I can't ask him for more." Blaine's gaze softened slightly before he pressed further. "What do you need so much money for?" I hesitated, guilt tightening my chest. My mind raced for the right words, but the truth felt too heavy to share. "There's someone," I began, but Blaine cut me off abruptly. "Forget it," he said dismissively, his tone sharp again. "I'm not interested in knowing about your life anymore." His words stung, leaving me torn between relief and sadness as the rest of the ride passed in silence. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. The tension between us was palpable, the unspoken words pressing down on me. Blaine finally broke the silence, his voice steady but with an edge I couldn't decipher. "Zoe," he said, my name slipping from his lips with a gravity that made my heart clench. "If you're really struggling for money, you should go to Matthew. He's your husband. He should share this burden with you. There's no need to push yourself so hard." His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his tone sharp and matter-of-fact, like he was delivering a solution to a simple problem. After a pause, he continued, "If Matthew refuses to help, I can lend you the money. You don't have to live like this." The weight of his words was unbearable. Tears welled up, and I could no longer hold them back. They spilled over, hot and uncontrollable. At the next red light, Blaine stopped the car. He turned toward me, his face softening just slightly. "Zoe, don't cry," he said, his tone almost pleading. I grabbed tissues and dabbed at my swollen, tear-streaked face. Catching a glimpse of myself in the mirror, I winced. My red, puffy eyes stared back at me, a reflection of the turmoil inside. Sighing, I reminded Blaine, "The light's green. You can drive now." He nodded but frowned deeply. "Are you sure you don't want me to drop you off in front of your house?" I shook my head quickly, almost too quickly. "No, there's no need. I'm fine." I couldn't let my sister Ziva see me getting out of Blaine's car. Though Blaine didn't say it aloud, I could see the assumption forming in his mind. He thought I was hiding from Matthew, not Ziva. The misunderstanding lingered between us, unspoken but suffocating. When we reached the curb, Blaine stopped the car and handed me my things. "Don't forget to use the ointment. If you feel any discomfort, come to the hospital and find me." "Thank you," I murmured, his concern both warming and heartbreaking. I stepped out into the rain, taking a few hurried steps away from the car. But then, as if something pulled me back, I stopped and turned to face him. "I forgot to tell you." "Congratulations," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Blaine's expression darkened instantly, his jaw tightening. "You came back just to say something so irrelevant?" His tone was cold, almost accusatory. I ignored the bitterness in his voice and took a deep breath. "You should cherish what you have with Sophia. Meeting the person you'll spend the rest of your life with is a blessing. To know someone completely, their good and bad, and still love them, to find someone who fits perfectly into your life and family is rare." My voice cracked, and I paused to steady myself. Memories of the past rushed back. Catherine Dexter's venomous words, the unbearable pain of Blaine's betrayal, the haunting questions. Why wasn't I enough? Why didn't he fight for me? Why did he choose to believe his mother over me? For 4 long years, I had taught myself not to wish for impossible things. Blaine had been my dream once, but dreams like that didn't come true. "So I wish you all the best," I finished, forcing the words out even as they tore me apart. I turned to leave, my steps heavy yet determined. The rain pelted down harder, but I didn't care. As I walked away, I couldn't resist signing a message to Blaine. A simple gesture that spoke volumes. "Please be happier than I am," I signed, knowing he might not understand. But Blaine did. I could feel his gaze on my back, and just as I disappeared into the night, I heard him shout something. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The rain blurred everything. My vision, my thoughts, my emotions. I couldn't tell where the rain ended and my tears began. Deep inside, I ached to say the words I'd held back for so long. "Blaine, do you know that I have never stopped loving you?" The following afternoon, I waited on a park bench near the hospital, the air heavy with anticipation. Blaine was late, an hour late. My patience, already frayed, stretched thin as I tried to focus on the sounds of birds and the rustling leaves, anything to distract me from the growing unease in my chest. When Blaine finally appeared, he strode over with a casual air, his hands tucked into his pockets. He offered a quick apology, explaining his delay as the result of his yearly physical examination. The mention of it made my heart skip. A physical examination. Did that include a blood test? The thought came unbidden, racing through my mind as I connected the dots. Blaine was Max's father, after all. He didn't notice my reaction. Instead, his gaze softened as he leaned closer, inspecting the wound on my face. His hand was gentle as he turned my chin slightly, observing the fading swelling with what seemed like genuine concern. He noted it was healing well, but I quickly pulled away, his touch feeling both familiar and foreign. Shaking off the moment, I refocused on why I had asked to meet him. I brought up what I had recently learned, that Blaine planned to press charges against the men who had attacked me in the hospital. His reaction was immediate, his expression tightening as suspicion flickered in his eyes. He didn't deny it. I asked him to drop the charges. His response was firm, resolute. No. Blaine's stubbornness matched my own, but his refusal was fueled by something deeper. Anger, perhaps even guilt. He pointed to the assault, to the wound on my face, as though those injuries made the situation non-negotiable. I avoided his gaze, staring at my lap instead. He was resolute, and I was torn. Then, unexpectedly, Blaine shifted the conversation. He made a proposal. Spend the following day with him and he would agree to drop the charges. The suggestion took me completely off guard. Spend an entire day together? The idea seemed absurd, almost like a form of emotional blackmail. Blaine's tone, however, carried a note of finality, as though this day would be our last chapter. Afterward, we would return to being strangers. The weight of his words settled heavily on me. The thought of one last day together stirred something raw and conflicted within me. I couldn't understand his motive. Why would he want this when we had both agreed to let go? As Blaine walked away, leaving me in stunned silence on the bench, my thoughts spiraled. What did he hope to accomplish? What did I? The idea of spending a full day with Blaine terrified me, but it also opened a door I hadn't dared approach for years. Could this be my chance to finally tell him the truth about Max? I didn't know what his intentions were, and I wasn't even sure of my own. But as I sat there in the quiet of the park, one thing became clear. I had a decision to make. The next morning, I found myself standing at Blaine's doorstep, an unsteady mix of anticipation and dread swirling in my chest. Blaine appeared at the door, his disheveled hair and sleepy eyes making him look both endearing and distant. "Good morning, Zoe," he greeted me casually, as though we weren't about to embark on a day that would be our last together. Without missing a beat, he suggested I make breakfast, and I agreed without hesitation. In the quiet of his kitchen, the air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. As we sat across the table, I broke the silence. "In the future, I'll contact Sophia directly about the renovation of your new house," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. Blaine nodded without hesitation. "Okay," he replied, his indifference cutting deeper than I'd anticipated. Before the weight of the moment could sink further, Blaine looked up suddenly. "Do you have anywhere you'd like to go in the next 24 hours? His question caught me off guard, and before I could respond, my phone rang from inside my bag. "Hold on," I muttered, retreating to the hall to answer. It was Matthew. His voice was tight with fear, and his words struck me like a thunderclap. Max had collapsed. His heart had stopped, but was resuscitated, and now he was in critical condition. Matthew's final words shattered me. Max may not have much time left. Time seemed to stop as panic gripped me. Grabbing my bag, I bolted toward the door. Blaine intercepted me, his voice sharp. "Where are you going?" I have something urgent to do. I have to leave now, I managed to say, my voice trembling violently. What about the 24 hours you promised me? Blaine demanded, anger lacing his tone. I turned to him, my desperation spilling over. Blaine, stop this. Let me go. His gaze turned icy, his voice a low hiss. Is he really that important to you? He was asking about Matthew, but my mind was consumed with thoughts of Max. He is the most important person in my life, I said, my voice breaking. So, Blaine, please let me go. For a moment, Blaine hesitated, his expression a mix of anger and something unspoken. Then he released me. Without looking back, I ran to the elevator and disappeared. Blaine stood frozen in the kitchen, jealousy and anger swirling within him. To him, I had chosen another man over him once again. When I arrived at the hospital, the sight of the red warning light outside the emergency room shattered me completely. Max was still being resuscitated, and the uncertainty was unbearable. Matthew found me crumbling in the corridor and pulled me into his arms, whispering words of comfort. But his efforts couldn't reach me. My sobs racked my body as I leaned into him, unable to control my grief. A nurse approached carefully, her tone gentle yet firm. Miss Fuller, I need a parent to sign this notice. I barely registered her words. Matthew tried to calm me, but I could feel the panic rising uncontrollably. This is a notice of critical condition, the nurse explained cautiously. Her words sent me spiraling into despair. We don't need to sign this. Max is going to be fine, I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. Zoe, listen to me, Matthew urged, his voice steady despite his own fear. This is just a formality. It doesn't mean this is over. But I couldn't hear him. The only thought in my mind was that Max needed saving, and I had only one option left. Blaine, I suddenly cried, pulling away from Matthew. Blaine can save Max. He's his father. He has to be a match. I'll go to him. I'll beg him. Without another word, I bolted down the hallway, my desperation propelling me forward. Blaine was my only hope now. Matthew quickly caught up to me as I bolted down the hallway, his grip firm as he pulled me back. I fought against him, fueled by desperation and fear for Max. My thoughts raced, clinging to the idea that Blaine could be the answer. Blaine was Max's father, and I believed his bone marrow could save our son. But Matthew's words shattered my fragile hope. Blaine wasn't a match. He had reviewed Blaine's blood test results from his recent physical, and the confirmation left me utterly defeated. My strength crumbled under the weight of his revelation, and I stood there, helpless. The hours that followed were agonizing. I remained outside the emergency room, unable to move, unwilling to abandon my vigil. My heart pounded with dread as I waited for any news. By noon, the doors to the emergency room opened, and Matthew emerged with a team of doctors and nurses. My legs barely carried me as I approached him, needing answers but terrified of what he might say. Matthew gripped my trembling hands, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Max had survived. Relief surged through me, and gratitude overwhelmed my heart. Tears streamed down my face as I silently gave thanks. Max was transferred to the ICU, where I could only see him through a small window in the door. I stood there for hours, unable to tear my gaze away from my fragile child. Every breath he took, every faint movement, was a sign of hope that kept me rooted in place. Matthew urged me to rest, but I refused. I was determined to stay by Max's side, no matter how long it took. Reluctantly, Matthew sat beside me and began explaining Max's condition. The news was grim. Chemotherapy would be necessary to stabilize Max's health and prevent further relapses. The words were like daggers to my heart. The thought of Max enduring the grueling treatment over and over again was almost unbearable. As a mother, the prospect of seeing him suffer in that way left me in turmoil, but I knew I couldn't falter. Max needed me to be strong. The financial burden loomed over me like a storm cloud. I knew my current jobs would never cover the mounting medical expenses, especially with the added costs of chemotherapy. Refusing Matthew's offer of financial help, I resolved to find another way. Within days, I secured a third job, working overnight shifts to make ends meet. Exhaustion became my constant companion, but I pushed forward, driven by my love for Max and my determination to give him the chance he deserved. No sacrifice felt too great, and I braced myself for the challenges ahead. Max's fight had become my fight, and I would do whatever it took to save him. Taking on a job as a cocktail waitress at Enclave was a practical decision, though not an easy one. The bar's proximity to St. Mary's allowed me to stay close to Max while earning a small salary supplemented by commission. Every dollar counted, and this job offered a glimmer of hope for easing the mounting financial strain. After my first late-night shift, I stumbled home just as the clock struck 4 in the morning. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but the minute I stepped into the bathroom, nausea overcame me. The stress, physical exertion, and lack of rest caught up, and I found myself doubled over, retching. The commotion woke my younger sister, Ziva, who appeared in the doorway with concern etched on her face. Despite her questions and insistence on knowing what had driven me to such lengths, I waved off her worries. She didn't understand the depth of my desperation or the urgency of Max's condition. Ziva's offer to approach extended family for help tugged at my heart, but I refused. This was my burden to bear, not hers. Later that evening, Enclave buzzed with energy. The neurology department of St. Mary's was celebrating a significant achievement. Their team of surgeons had been recognized as the best in the hospital. Their jubilation filled the air with an electric atmosphere, and the bar staff, myself included, worked tirelessly to meet their demands. As the night wore on, my manager approached me, his expression hurried but encouraging. A VIP hostess was needed, and he offered me a trial run in one of the private rooms. The opportunity for higher commissions was too good to pass up, and I agreed without hesitation. Pushing the liquor cart into the assigned VIP room, I was focused on making a good impression. But the moment I stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. Among the lively group seated around the table, one familiar face stood out like a beacon: Blaine. The shock of seeing him there rendered me momentarily immobile. His steely gray eyes locked onto mine, and the atmosphere seemed to shift. The chatter and laughter of the room faded into the background, replaced by an almost tangible tension. My presence clearly stunned his colleagues, who exchanged curious glances. Their surprise at seeing me there only heightened my discomfort. Blaine's gaze was sharp, cold even, as if demanding an explanation I wasn't prepared to give. I felt exposed, as though my secrets were laid bare in the fluorescent glow of the room. The weight of my reality pressed down on me, working 3 jobs, sacrificing sleep, and enduring physical and emotional exhaustion, all to scrape together enough money to save my son. But how could I explain this to Blaine? How could I tell him that the woman he once knew was now navigating a labyrinth of hardships, driven by the fierce determination to protect her child? The words stuck in my throat unspoken. As I carried out my duties in the VIP room, the ache in my chest grew heavier with every passing moment. I knew Blaine wouldn't let this encounter slide, but for now, I focused on keeping my composure. My pride and resolve wouldn't allow me to falter, not even under his scrutinizing gaze.
Hey, I'm Zoe. If you're wondering what happens next, download the Pocket FM app now and listen to the exciting episodes of Rekindled Heartache.